All right, we've got Doug Wilson here, who is the author of Let's Play 2, The Life and Times of Ernie Banks. Doug, thanks for joining us on the pod here.
Well, thanks for having me on.
Of course. So first off, I won't give away your phone number. I won't dox you, but I noticed the area code. That is the same area code as my wife. Are you in Indiana right now?
Yeah, I'm just south of Indianapolis.
Okay, nice. I was there last week. I went to I was doing a show in Indianapolis, and I went to Ball State University, so I know a lot of those.
Okay,
a lot of those area codes. One of the so you've written. This is not your first baseball book, right?
Yeah, it's actually my fifth.
Okay, so what have the other books been about? Can you give us a rundown?
Well, the first one was kind of a local Cincinnati Reds legend, a guy named Fred Hutchinson.
Okay.
He was more from back in the 50s and 60s, but then I did one on Mark Fidrich, the bird.
Sure.
Anybody remembers the 1970s? He was kind of the quintessential 1970s kind of guy.
Yeah, he was a big weirdo who had a great he had a great short run, right?
Yeah, a lot of fun.
Yeah.
And I did one on Brooks Robinson, and my last one was on Carlton Fisk.
Nice. And then now to Ernie Banks. And I was reading through your bio, one thing that stuck out to me. You played college ball. Is that right?
Yeah. I played in college. It's 1,000 years ago. I
Sure.
tell everybody I realized my batting average was lower than my grade point average, and so I knew I needed to do something else to make a living. So I went to medical school.
Well, it's good you had a good statistical comparison between the two that you could make very cold and front office like that you could figure that out. What was the scouting report on yourself?
Short but slow and extremely myopic.
Well, great. Well, I mean, already throwing myopic into a scouting report, I think, is very authorly. That's a giveaway for what the career would be. What was the team you grew up rooting for?
Well, I grew up just loving baseball. My dad was in the Air Force, so we moved around a little bit.
Okay.
And, we lived in Florida for a while. We were close to the Minnesota Twins spring training site, and so Harmon Killebrew was my big hero for a while. And,
that's a good one.
Then we moved to Kentucky and rooted for the Cincinnati Reds, the Big Red Machine, and and the Cubs, of course, captured everybody's fancy in the late '60s. Just such a great cast of characters.
Sure.
That you just couldn't help but fall in love with them.
And what what is it that specifically brought you to Ernie Banks as your latest subject?
Well, again, I like to write about the guys that I enjoyed and I knew in the 60s and 70s, and also guys that I felt were icons of the game. There's certain players that just transcended the game with their personalities and just their feats, and also I look at guys that haven't had a lot written about them, and I was really surprised that nobody's really done a serious look at Ernie's career and life. He wrote an autobiography in 1971, and that's really about it. And like I said, it's amazing because he's held in such high esteem even now in
Right.
Chicago. But I think one of the things is everybody thinks they know everything they need to know about Ernie. And unfortunately, they don't. I learned an awful lot and found out a lot of myths and legends that had grown over the years that, the truth was actually better then.
Yeah, that is really interesting that the main book about him came out so quickly after his playing career, and that's it, when so much of his life was, he was in the public eye for so long after that.
Yeah. Yeah, and the thing about Ernie, not to say anything bad about him, but he absolutely could not do two things. One, he couldn't say something good about himself. He never bragged or anything. So if you take Ernie's word for it in interviews and his autobiography, he just lucked out. People just wanted to give him money to stick him in the middle of their infield, and he never had any idea why. And the other thing is he couldn't say anything bad about anybody else. And, in Ernie's life growing up, there were some challenges he had to overcome. And some people who weren't that nice to him, and that adds spice to the story, but you certainly weren't going to get it from Ernie because he never said anything bad about anybody.
Yeah, and I think that is something that is overlooked about Ernie Banks, since what we know of him, especially what a lot of baseball fans now know about him, is just, the sunny personality and always being happy and Mr. Cub. But I mean, he really broke in pretty shortly after integration, and I think you don't really think of like I'm 36 years old, so my baseball fandom, in my head he wasn't as close to that sort of struggle as I guess in reality he was.
Yeah, you just didn't hear as much about it by then. He came to the Cubs 6 years after Jackie Robinson broke in, and so he was part of the second wave. Him and Willie Mays, Hank Aaron.
Right.
They certainly didn't take the abuse that Jackie took, but there were a lot of spoken and unspoken things that, for instance, his first year he couldn't stay in the hotel with the team in St. Louis. In '62, when Houston came into the league, Ernie had been in the big leagues 9 years, and he couldn't stay in the hotel. Of course, in the spring they were down south. They would barnstorm or play games in Texas, Mississippi, working their way back up to Chicago after spring, and so they certainly faced a lot of stuff, a lot of challenges that really, baseball is a hard enough game to play on its own, and to have that other stuff hanging over your head, you got to give those guys credit.
Sure, and he actually spent time in the Negro Leagues, correct?
Yeah. He as a 19-year-old, he graduated high school one day, got on a bus. The next day, put on a uniform of the Kansas City Monarchs, playing for legendary Buck O'Neil. And, Ernie sort of fell into a great situation because the Monarchs were like the New York Yankees of the Negro League. They were the flagship team.
Right.
And, of course, Buck O'Neil, his personality, his way of handling men, you couldn't have picked a better manager to come in under. And Ernie certainly picked up a lot of things from Buck on the field and off the field, just with his personality. And Ernie's first roommate with the Monarchs was Elston Howard, who got signed and went to the Yankees.
Right, Yankees MVP. He won the MVP with the Yankees, right?
Yeah. The shortstop position that Ernie took as a teenager, 3 years earlier, Jackie Robinson had been the Monarch shortstop.
Jesus.
And so pretty big shoes to fill.
Yeah, yeah, very much so. That's a tough rebuild. And how quick? So how did it come to be that he gets plucked from the Kansas City Monarchs to the Chicago Cubs specifically? Was it a thing where he was highly in demand among all teams? What was it like when he came into the league?
Ernie certainly slipped through everybody's fingers. He played with the Monarchs in 1950, and then he got drafted. They had the draft back then, so he spent 2 years in the Army, and a big percentage of that he was in Europe. And so he sort of fell off any radars that he had been on. He came back in '53. He was the class of the Negro Leagues. Everybody acknowledged he was the best player. He had over 400. But back then, a lot of scouts from some teams seemed to look for excuses why these guys couldn't make it in the majors. And, famous scouting report on Willie Mays said he couldn't hit a curveball.
Sure.
I think Willie proved that guy wrong.
Yeah, he did okay.
But that was a lot of teams had guys mention, people say, hey, look at this guy Banks, and they would send a token or scout over, and they would come back and say, well, he's got a bad arm, or he can't do this or that. The Cubs really scouted him a lot, though. They had about 6 or 7 different guys. The first guy that saw him was in town looking at an outfielder, and he just happened to notice this shortstop for the Monarchs and sent back a big report. So they sent a couple checkers and a couple more checkers and a couple more checkers. And so the Cubs knew what they had, and they knew what they were getting. Why anybody else didn't recognize it, I have no idea. But he was there. He was there cheap. The Cubs got him for $25,000. $25,000 for Ernie Banks and a minor league pitcher. The Cubs organization didn't do a lot of things right in those days.
Yeah, and for a while after that.
The famous statement on their general manager at the time was he was so dumb if Mr. Wrigley had sent him out to buy a pack of gum, he would have came back with some beach nut instead of Wrigley's. But that was definitely the Ernie Banks deal was probably the best deal they ever made.
Yeah.
But again, they knew what they were getting because he late in September 1953, they bought his contract. He played a game in Pittsburgh with the Monarchs, got on a plane, landed in Chicago, and the next day he was in uniform with the Cubs. That was extremely rare for players to go straight from the Negro Leagues to the major leagues.
So he completely
very few guys.
Yeah, so he skipped the minors completely.
Yeah, and the Cubs brought him straight there. So, you look at Jackie Robinson, Roy Campanella, and Don Newcomb, the Monty Irvins, Larry Dobies, Willie Mays, Hank Aaron, all those guys went to the minor leagues for at least a little while to get used to the, what they at the time called organized ball. But Ernie didn't. He stepped right into the lineup. Worked out with the team a couple of days. Then they put him in the lineup. He hit over 300 for the rest of the season, and the rest was history. He never came out of the lineup for 16, 17 more years.
I think one thing I noticed in your bio that I thought was pretty interesting was that you've been recognized by the SABR organization, correct?
Yeah.
Which is go ahead.
Yeah, the Society for American Baseball Research, and they do a lot of the statistical stuff that everybody hates. I'm more into it for the research and the history. He said I like looking at the guys' personalities more than their numbers.
Sure. I was gonna say not to ask for a complete wins above replacement kind of breakdown, but in terms of Ernie Banks, he is such a guy where we know the personality and we know he was sort of among the greats at the time. Do you have just a little bit of perspective for people who haven't looked at the stat line, like just how good was Ernie Banks during those years when he played for so many losing teams?
He was incredible. He was incredible. He revolutionized the position of shortstop. Even with the old-fashioned stats of just home runs, RBIs, for 6 years in the late 50s, Ernie had more home runs and RBIs than anybody, period. Yeah. More than Mays, Mano, Aaron, anybody. He averaged over 40 home runs for 6 seasons, averaged over 110 RBIs for 6 seasons. Yeah. And so, and he was a shortstop. Before Ernie Banks, the National League record for home runs in a season by a shortstop was 23. Yeah, Ernie had that by July of his second season. He had 44 home runs his second season. And even now, Ernie had, if you throw out the guy, the steroid abuser, Ernie has the top 5 home run seasons of any shortstop in Major League history. Rico Petrocelli hit 40 in 1969 for the Red Sox. But
right.
Other than that, it's all Ernie, without chemicals.
Right. And
so, he was, and that's a sad thing. I think a lot of people forget how good he was in his prime. As a shortstop, he didn't have the range that Louis Aparicio had, but he wasn't bad. He had good hands, and he didn't throw the ball away. One year he had a record for the fewest errors by a shortstop in the National League. He only had 12, and he won 1 Gold Glove at shortstop.
Yeah, that's
so to get that kind of production is. But you asked about WAR. The second year he won the MVP. 59. His WAR was way better. I think it was like 10.4. And second in the league was Willie Mays with 8.3.
Oh man, I wasn't expecting you to have the WAR numbers off the top like that. But yeah,
anyway you cut it out. He was the best.
It is interesting because I do think it does get overlooked that, as you say, he was a completely new kind of player at that position. I'm just going through my head thinking of the legendary shortstops before him. No one's really a power hitter unless you're talking about like Honus Wagner, I guess, and that was a totally different level,
Yeah, it's really Ernie and Honus. That's it.
Yeah.
Everybody else is on the second level of the conversation.
Yeah.
Even a lot of people nowadays credit Cal Ripken as being the standard of the big slugging shortstop. And, Ripken never hit more than 34 home runs in a year.
Mm-hmm.
So Ernie, like I said, had 45 times. So Ernie was way ahead of him.
Yeah, that's and I think, as you said, you what you really like going into is more the stories behind these great players and personalities, and that's so much of what's in the book, which again is called Let's Play 2: The Life and Times of Ernie Banks, and this is the author Doug Wilson, and that's available. You can go online, go to bookstores right now and get it. It's out as we speak, correct?
Yep. Yeah. It came out last week. It should be on all the bookstores. It's all your normal online things. And I just found out at the Chicago area Costco's.
Oh, there we go. Get in there. Throw it on.
Be easy to find.
Throw it on top of the 12-pound cereal boxes and everything else they got in there. So one thing I wanted to ask is how, like, with a book like this, what is the process as far as finding people to talk to and to get these stories that haven't been told other places? Because I imagine, especially with players who, Ernie has since left us, and I'd imagine a lot of the people with firsthand stories about him from his playing days are older. And what is the process like as far as reaching out to people like that and finding who you should speak to?
That's definitely the hardest part, and to me, I think that's essential because you can only get so much out of newspapers and old magazines and books. And there's no substitute for listening to a guy who was there. Not just the baseball players. I found several guys who grew up with Ernie, and that was really difficult because where he grew up doesn't exist anymore. It was the ghetto and Jim Crow, Dallas.
Right.
And their neighborhood had been plowed under and asphalted and swept under the carpet. But I found several guys who grew up, and it was just incredible listening to those guys talk, and not only just about Ernie, but how they grew up. And that, because I have no reference for that, growing up under that kind of stress and that kind of situation. And so it gives you a whole different perspective. But then I found several guys who played with Ernie in the Negro Leagues too, on the Monarchs, and they were great, on their own right. Just listen to their travels, and it was neat listening to about Ernie's personality. He was really quiet in those days in high school and with the Monarchs. Nobody ever called him Mr. Monarch, for instance.
Right.
That personality didn't exist until he had been in Chicago for 4 or 5 years and got comfortable. But so it is important to find those guys, and it's hard because most of them are 80, 85 years old. The best guys I've found in all my books to get a hold of are relief pitchers.
Oh, that's interesting.
Because
they're weirdos.
Most of their career sitting out in the bullpen telling jokes, being ignored by the usual press, especially relievers in the 50s and 60s.
Right.
Nobody came to interview those, so you get one of those guys on the phone, and you just sit back and listen to stories. There was one guy who was actually with the Cubs when Ernie came up. His name is Bob Willis. Was a pitcher. He played in 53 and 54. He's still farming. He's 90 years old, still farming the family farm in Louisiana. He kept telling stories, and I started feeling bad. I was taking all his time. I was trying to hang up. He goes, "Wait a minute. You called me. You don't get to hang up till I say you do. I got another story for you."
I mean, that's a fair rule. That's a fair standard. And yeah, as you say, it's especially with guys from that era, and if you're talking about guys from the Negro Leagues, it's a lot of guys who have not gotten to tell these stories in any sort of large scale. And
and they didn't make money back then. I think it's overused. They played for the love of the game, but you listen to them talk, they really did, and they enjoy talking about their days. They didn't get hounded as much as the guys who made the big money in the 80s and 90s. They don't want to talk to you. They got more money. They can get $30,000 a weekend scribbling their name, so they don't want to waste their time talking to somebody. But these older guys, they really appreciate it.
That's great. Do you have any like short story that stood out to you that was particularly surprising or interesting? That was one you didn't tell before. We don't want to give away the whole book, but is there anything like that you remember being surprised by?
Well, the just surprising at Ernie's personality that the players were always amazed. He would come up with these things that if anybody else said it, they would boo him off the bus and laugh at him. But Glenn Becker, a story that one time they were supposed to play their Tacoma, Washington team, the AAA team. It was a exhibition scheduled, and they'd had a rain out, and so they didn't get in till like 3 a.m. Nobody wanted to play. It's cold and miserable. Everybody's in a nasty mood. Before they get off the plane, Ernie gets up and says, for all you new guys, I don't know if you know, but Tacoma, Washington has the world's largest totem pole. And tomorrow morning at 8 o'clock, I'm taking a tour out there, so you guys aren't going to want to miss that. Becker goes, who the hell wants to see a totem pole at 8 in the morning? But that was just the way he was. He always found something.
Oh, man, I envy that sort of enthusiasm and energy for anything. I do a lot of traveling for my job, and I always envy the person who's looking for the interesting things in that town as opposed to, I'm firing up MLB.TV basically and just staying in the room. That's great, and it's cool, and it's also nice to know that some of that energy and enthusiasm that Ernie is known for, that it's there when the camera was off. Nobody knows about that, but the guys who were there that are telling you that story. Thank you so much for coming on the show to talk about it. One more time, do you want to tell us the title of the book and where you'd like people to find it?
Yeah, it's Let's Play 2, The Life and Times of Ernie Banks, and it's available in all bookstores and online, and it's out right now.
Awesome. Thanks so much, Doug. And again, this is Douglas Wilson. Thank you so much for hanging out with us on Away Games.
Well, thanks for having me on. I enjoyed it.